more people will be coming in, but we can at least get started. So welcome everyone. Thank you for logging on and attending the next installation in the Economics and Science series with George Burnell. Unfortunately, this evening, George will not be here for the intro or on camera due to a health issue, but is in attendance. My name is Matt Schumann. I am on the programming team at the library. Before we begin, just a few things to note. Please let me know in the chat if there are any technical issues and I can try to resolve them. If you have any questions, or comments, please use the Q&A button, or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you. This program was made possible by the generous donors to the Cary Library Foundation, and thanks to George Burnell. If you're interested in purchasing Dan's book, The Right Price, A Value-Based Prescription for Drug Costs, it is available through Porter Square Books. And now, Dan Ollendorf is the Director of Value Measurement and Global Health Initiatives at the Center for the Evaluation of Value and Risk in Health, or CEVR. His research interests include expanding the use of health technology assessment in low and middle income economies, as well as refinement of value assessment tools in the US. Prior to joining CEVR, Dr. Ollendorf was Chief Scientific Officer for the Institute of Clinical and Economic Review, or ICER, for over 10 years, where he was responsible for scientific oversight of all clinical and economic aspects of the health technology assessment process. Dr. Ollendorf holds a PhD in clinical epidemiology from the University of Amsterdam and an MPH from Boston University. He's the current chair of the Health Technology Assessment International Global Policy Forum and served on the US Medicare Evidence Development and Coverage Advisory Committee from 2015 to 2019. Dr. Ollendorf has authored over 100 articles in peer-reviewed journals and is the co-author of The Right Price, A Value-Based Prescription for Drug Costs from Oxford University Press. So now please welcome Dan Ollendorf.
Thanks very much, Matt. Let me just share my screen here. Assuming you can see that okay, great. Well, thanks very much, Matt, and to Cary Library for inviting me to give this talk. I'm very grateful for that opportunity. So I'm going to talk to you all about a lot of the themes that were raised in the book that my co-authors and I wrote. Title of the presentation is Drug Prices in the USA, What Are We Paying For? So we're paying high prices in this country. What is that actually buying us? So I've broken my talk up into 4 major components. So I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about the technical aspects of how value is captured when you're talking about prescription drugs. And then we'll talk about the mechanism. Matt mentioned health technology assessment, the kind of platform for actually making value-based decisions about the kinds of services and treatments that we adopt. Then we'll talk about the setting here in the US and whether the drug prices that we see actually are equivalent to value to the consumer, to the patient, to society as a whole. And then I'll conclude by talking about, with all of the discussion around drug pricing reform, what the prospects for future policy change might be in the US. So those of you who are economists in the audience might get a chuckle out of this little title, A Brief History of Time Trade-Offs. So that's one of the scientific approaches to try to understand what value people assign to given states of health, time trade-off. And we're going to talk a little bit now about how the value of prescription drugs, or any other health service for that matter, is captured and what some of those historical roots have been. So how did this all start? Well, the relationship of price to the price of any good to utility or to value is really nothing new. In 18th century classical economics, so the economics of Adam Smith or Thomas Malthus, this kind of information really focused on the utility of a given good to society or to a distinct class in society. But that began to change, well, and we'll talk about that in a second. Utility to the individual has been really discussed for a very long time, in fact, dating all the way back to the ancient Greeks. But The formal approach to individuals' value assessment, so the individual assessment of value of a given product or good, was really first proposed by Jeremy Bentham in the early 19th century, a historian and philosopher. So Bentham's principles are these, and you'll see these and feel that they have a lot of common sense benefit or thought to you. So one of the principles is that individuals have a right to choose based on what is best for that individual. The welfare of an individual does not depend on that of any other. And societal welfare is the sum of individual utilities. So the former schools of thought used to think about summing utilities across society based on what a class dictated rather than an individual. Each individual carries equal weight in collective decisions, so no one opinion should be valued above any other. And free market competition, true free market competition, improves the welfare only under conditions of equal opportunity. So if you think about this in terms of health, people have to have an equal opportunity to access the benefits of a given intervention to really see society move forward as a whole in terms of welfare. Now, if you think about each of these points, this is kind of anathema when you think about 19th century England, Victorian England, where class was really the ruling measure of what was valuable. So not surprisingly, Bentham actually received some flack, a fair amount of flack for his opinions. He was really saved by the fact that he had a big case of writer's block. And in fact, most of his writings occurred after his death by friends and colleagues. So there were really some threats to this thinking, and it really began to change, but only gradually. So one of the key things here that's carried through to how value is measured is that utility can be measured in cardinal terms, in numeric terms. So it's not as though this is just a philosophy that exists out in the ether. It can actually be measured, and we'll talk about how that's evolved over time. Just a bit of an aside about Bentham himself. He was kind of an odd person. One of the stipulations he put in his will is that his body needed to be preserved by a taxidermist and wheeled out at dinner parties on an occasional basis. And in truth, his body still does exist in preserved form at University College of London. I think his head is actually decayed too much. So it's stored somewhere else, but then also brought out occasionally for special occasions. So that's just a brief aside. So moving from how utility to the individual then generates a measure of health benefit that's used in the kind of analysis I'll be talking about, quality adjusted life years, or QALYs. We then have to go through a bit of evolution as well. So the development of the QALY is the stuff of legend. So cost effectiveness analysis and its use of the QALY first kind of got some renown in terms of application to health when considerations around extending Medicare benefits, which were reserved entirely for those 65 and older, to patients with end-stage renal disease in the 1960s began to take hold. So the idea that a special benefit for Medicare for a population by and large that is not 65 and older was done based on the potential benefit that these patients would receive and whether the incremental cost that would be associated would be both affordable and would be worth that investment. In addition, the World Health Organization has often thought about health programming globally and how health benefits can be distributed across the population. And so there's some connection to QALYs there as well. There's a lot of suspicion about this measure. I'll talk about that a little bit later on. So maybe it was a government plot, who knows? In truth, the roots of this really were in attempts to measure the quality of hospital care initially by categorizing the post-discharge experience. So it was really just trying to understand, based on what kind of health you were in after discharge from the hospital, how could that be measured? How could that utility of that health state be captured in some sort of reasonable summary of health. So let's just talk about the quality calculation very simply, and that's really what it is. It's relatively simple. It's a summary measure that's intended to try to capture the benefits of a treatment or another intervention in terms of how that intervention extends your life and how it improves your life. So it's capturing the number of years lived in a given health state multiplied by an assigned utility. I mentioned cardinal terms, an assigned numeric utility for that health state. So typically, a quality exists on a scale from 0 to 1. So 0 is represents death and 1 represents perfect health. So if you think about living 10 years in perfect health, that equals 10 years, 10 times 1. If you have a utility of 0.75 for a given health state, so you're not in perfect health, then that period of time is valued at 3.75, 5 times 0.75. So if you think about 10 years of perfect health plus 5 years of somewhat less than perfect health, you get a total of 13.75. So a relatively simple calculation. So then how does this get put together to actually value health and to try to understand whether the costs associated with a new treatment or intervention are worth those benefits? So formalized cost-effectiveness analysis was initially developed in the 1960s to assist with resource allocation in the military, in fact. In the mid-70s, Milt Weinstein at Harvard and Stason published a landmark paper that tried to adapt traditional cost-effectiveness analysis to a healthcare setting. So essentially, this was a generation of an analysis that focused on the net costs associated with the introduction of whatever the intervention was to the net benefits received by the use of that intervention. Based on the history I just described, the utility weights were used to adjust the life expectancy for the quality of life that the patients would be experiencing. As is common in all areas of economics, future costs and benefits are worth less than they are at present. So discounting was used to discount those future costs and benefits. And if any sort of simulation modeling was used, and that's typically the approach taken, sensitivity analyses were done to try to address the robustness of the model, to try to understand where the uncertainties may lay. Again, the ratio is relatively straightforward. So here we're looking at a new treatment for hepatitis C in comparison to an old one. And the ICER, the incremental cost effectiveness ratio in this case, represents the net cost of adding that new hepatitis C therapy. So the cost of the new therapy, subtracting out the cost of the old therapy. That's a ratio, so that's the numerator. The denominator would be the change in QALYs, so the health benefit gained by the new therapy, subtracting out the health benefit gained by the old therapy. So the incremental cost over the incremental benefits yields a cost per QALY gained, essentially. So then you generate a number, but what does it actually mean? Health economists like to report these results on a cost effectiveness frontier. And so if you think about this frontier in quadrants, if you look at the upper left, you'll see a new treatment that will be cost increasing. So it will be higher cost than the current standard of care, but it's also less effective than the current standard of care. So you would universally reject that treatment. If you think about the lower right of the quadrant, then it's the opposite decision. You have a new treatment that is more effective than the current standard of care, and it's less expensive. So you would universally adopt that treatment. Where the decisions get tougher are in the other two quadrants. And so it's not typically the case that when you're doing a cost effectiveness analysis on something new, that you're looking at the lower left quadrant. In other words, a situation where you have a less effective treatment that's also less costly than the standard of care. What you're mostly seeing is situations that occur on the right. So you have incremental benefit coming in from a new treatment. So a new treatment is better than what you're using now, but it also costs more money. And then you need to make a decision about what your threshold is for determining whether it is cost effective for your purposes. So then you have a threshold problem to think about. The ideal would be some measure of society's willingness to pay for a unit of health gained. So in this case, what is it worth to gain a QALY to that given society? I'm using 50,000 per QALY gained as an example here. It's actually something that's been used really without a clear, understandable rationale for it in the US for a very long time. Kind of a curiously resilient measure, but no one's really sure exactly where it came from. So in fact, society willingness to pay in health is something that's really has not been done very frequently. So the reality is a far more muddled picture. And so in some cases, there have been empiric exercises done to try to understand what a society is willing to pay. And in fact, based on the health system's realities, if it's a fixed budget health system, for example, what they can actually afford to pay. The WHO in its work has loosely correlated the willingness to pay for gains in health with per capita income. So essentially, you should not be willing to part with more than what you make in a given year to gain a unit of health. In other cases, like with the 50,000 per QALY gained, it may be that decision makers just liked round numbers. They were easier to describe. And in many cases, something can be very cost effective and actually not have a very strong correlation to actual health budgets. So I did mention hepatitis C in that illustrative example of how a cost effectiveness ratio is calculated. New drugs for hepatitis C were introduced in 2014, 2015 that really changed the picture for treatment for these patients. These were curative therapies, curative at a very high level, where prior therapies were both toxic and resulted in much lower cure rates. So these really were a huge benefit to the hepatitis C population. They were also priced in the $80,000 to $90,000 range for a course of treatment, so they were very expensive. But from a cost effectiveness standpoint, they were highly cost effective. So they were generating cost effectiveness ratios that were well within a lot of the decision points I just described. But at the same time, they had the potential to break budgets because many patients with hepatitis C are in situations like Medicare coverage or in prisons, and the pharmacy budgets for those settings were very, very small in relation to what they'd have to spend on trying to eliminate this virus. So there was an affordability issue that was introduced at the same time that something looked cost effective. And so there has to be really attention paid to both. So let's move from the actual calculation to how value-based decisions are actually made by decision makers and policymakers. So I talked about health technology assessment. This discipline has also been around since the 1960s. It's really a natural outgrowth of society's growing need to keep pace with technological innovation, not only in health, but in many other disciplines as well. And in this case, of course, determine whether the benefits provided by a new innovation are really worth that extra cost. Now, HTA exists in essentially every developed nation except for this one in the form of government or quasi-governmental agencies. So let's talk about HTA outside of the US first. The basic approach involves an analysis of the clinical evidence, so the clinical trials for a new drug, for example, the cost effectiveness of that new drug relative to the standard of care, and the budgetary impact. Most of these organizations have strong engagement with patient groups, manufacturers, clinical societies, and payers, because this is a collective conversation about the potential benefit of a new treatment or intervention. There are ethical rules set up for deliberation, typically by a committee of experts or other health services professionals who are independent from the HTA agency. So this is an independent deliberation to try to understand, based on the evidence presented to them, whether there's a recommendation to adopt the treatment, adopt it with some conditions on its use, or reject it outright. And the important thing here is that in these other countries, HTA is a required step. So you submit, as a drug manufacturer, you submit your clinical information to the regulator, to the FDA here, but to the European Medicines Agency, for example. And that then results in approval to market the product. But you do not get adopted and reimbursed until you go through the HTA step in these other countries. So it's a very different situation relative to the US. So back to the thresholds for a second. Again, you see a lot of variation in what good value is interpreted to be by country or by HTA authority. So the organization in England, one of the best known HTA bodies, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, or NICE, has a standard range of 20,000 to 30,000 pounds per QALY gained for a treatment that they will adopt, although they do have some special cases as well. There are also single thresholds in selected other countries that range somewhere between 20,000 and 45,000 euros per QALY gained. Thresholds are more dynamic, so there's not a fixed threshold in some other settings that have been doing this for a long time, like Canada and Australia. So quite a bit of variation. So let's turn to HTA in the US then. And I'm talking about a tortured past and a cautious present, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. But one important thing to think about going in is that in this country, FDA approval means approval to market. Now, it's not necessarily going to be the case that every payer will then say, I'm going to cover your drug. But more often than not, there is some coverage provided by the payer, and the negotiation is around price rather than adoption itself. In other situations, there are cases, for example, that have been brought to us by the Affordable Care Act, in which there are classes of drugs, 6 classes of drugs, where all payers have to agree to cover those drugs. They can put restrictions on the coverage, but they have to cover those drugs regardless. So here, essentially, regulatory approval means adoption. And so there is no HTA step to try to think about what the value that a new treatment might bring is. Let's think about whether that's always been the case. So the evolution of the science around cost effectiveness, as I mentioned, led many governments to embrace it as a tool for decision-making within the HTA platform. Medicare tried to do the same thing in the late 80s. It failed, the proposed rule failed, and there are a lot of themes that came around that failure that are listed here that I think apply to a lot of attempts to try to reform healthcare that followed. They also, in some ways, speak to the political environment in general that still exists in this country, mistrust of the science. We've certainly heard about that with a lot of frequency over the past year and a half. So because of that failure, you have kind of bizarre situations like this one. So one of my co-authors, Peter Newman, published a paper about 15 years ago saying, okay, Medicare tried to do this. The proposed rule failed. So what is actually happening in terms of demonstrated cost effectiveness versus use of particular services in Medicare? You have something that's generally considered a very good value, like colon cancer screening with very low usage rates. Now, those of us of a certain age will resonate with the notion that maybe it's the prep for this particular intervention that is keeping the usage rates low. But you then contrast that with something that has been demonstrated to be highly cost ineffective, left ventricular assist devices, with a high volume of use. So in essence, Medicare is essentially paying a lot of money for some services that really weren't worth it. Now, interestingly, the US has actually made some attempts at HTA in the past. So the Office of Technology Assessment, which was an official government agency that advised Congress on technology issues, was funded in the early 70s, had a very unique model with a politically and special interest balanced governing board. So no one industry or sector had a bigger voice than another. Was held up as an international example of robust science and methods. So it used cost effectiveness analysis liberally, including in health. But it began to die a slow death in part because this was one of the organizations that questioned the scientific and economic feasibility of Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative. You'll remember the Star Wars program. And so it became kind of a political hot potato at that point, was eventually defunded in 1995. So contrast that with another new organization, a quasi-governmental organization that was created as part of the ACA, private organization receiving government appropriations, also had a multi-stakeholder governing board, but not a balanced one. So certain interests have much more of a say in what PCORI does than others. And there was explicit language because there was a worry that the US would adopt something that would look a lot like NICE in the UK. There was explicit language saying, essentially, you can't do cost effectiveness analysis. So they really haven't done any assessment of cost effectiveness or cost at all at PCORI. PCORI still does exist, done a lot of important work in terms of expanding the patient voice in research. But is not thought about these thorny questions of cost and benefit. So now what? Well, as Matt mentioned, I used to be part of an organization also called ICER, a little confusing, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. So I helped lead their scientific apparatus for a little over 10 years. So what is ICER? It is an independent, not-for-profit organization. It did start out academically at Mass General and an affiliation with Harvard Medical School, but is now a fully independent, not-for-profit. About 15 years old. Many of its processes and the transparency that it tries to provide were inspired by the International HTA experience. And its reviews are timed to coincide with regulatory approval. So as I mentioned, that's when drugs can first be marketed in the US. And so ICER tries to draw its conclusions and produce its reports around the time of regulatory approval to hopefully spark a discussion about appropriate coverage policy and pricing for new interventions. It's foundation funded. And because of this, they're able to make all of their work products freely and publicly available. So you can go to their website, icer.org, and download whatever you'd like to see. So what have the results been on pricing? And this is kind of a segue into does drug pricing equal value in the US? So you see a list of drugs on the left. You also see what ICER suggests should be a discount, or in some cases a premium from the list price to be considered cost effective. And ICER considers anything that would generate a cost effectiveness ratio between $100,000 and $150,000 per quality, the most liberal cost effectiveness threshold that's been published worldwide, in fact. They would consider that to be cost effective. But what you see here are a lot of numbers in red. So these are the discounts that would be required to get to that $100,000 to $150,000 range. And you see these discounts in some cases that are very close to 100%. And so yes, there are some pricing challenges. You do see a number of situations, including in some cases, high-priced drugs that could actually be even higher priced and still generate the right amount of benefit to be considered cost-effective. And that's because they are producing a lot of benefits. So there are some true innovations to consider as well. And then on the right, ICER also does an analysis about whether a budget impact of a new treatment might pose a problem that would need to be managed by the health system as well. So this is a bit of a foreshadowing to the drug pricing discussion we'll have next. And here we are. So you've probably seen some of these statistics before. Prices here are generally 2 to 3 times higher than what's paid in other very high income developed countries. So in cases here, you see cancer drugs that are routinely in the multiple hundreds of thousands per year, specialized treatments that might actually be over $1 million or $2 million in some cases for gene therapies as well. We also have issues with the way insurance is delivered. So there are high out-of-pocket costs for many patients and many types of coverage. And the notion of medical bankruptcy really is an issue only germane to the US. It doesn't really happen anywhere else. So we've got some major issues. The question is, are very high-priced drugs a good value? And as I kind of alluded to in the previous slide, sometimes that is the case, but the problem that we're dealing with is that prices are universally high for new treatments. And that really is done without any attention paid to the value brought by those treatments. So I do want I know that there are probably some folks in the audience who work in the pharma and biotech space, and I'm not trying to kind of tweak you any further, but I do want to speak to the notion that drug pricing has certainly been an issue. It's a big issue on voters' minds. There are lots of reforms being discussed in Congress and elsewhere that I'll talk about. But the industry response to those questions, concerns, and criticisms has typically been statements like this. So we'll hear that list prices are increasing, but similar to the automobile industry, nobody pays list price. Payers and pharmacy benefit managers may extract big discounts. And when you think about net pricing, prices have been stable or have declined. But the statistics don't really bear that out completely. So if you look at this graph from a recently published analysis, you see that list prices have grown exponentially. Net prices were as well until about 2015, when they began to modulate. My own personal theory is that that's when the value conversation really started to take hold in the US for the first time in a significant way. And so the attention paid is probably a strong relation to how the net prices have modulated a bit over time. Now, this is an overall average across all classes of drugs. So it's a 50% increase across all classes of drugs since 2007. But if you think about some specific classes of drugs, the net price increases have been very, very large as well. So areas like multiple sclerosis or rare diseases come to mind. So significant increases, not a big understanding of how that, what the rationale is or how it's tied to value. Should also mention that this is one of 2 countries in the world that allows prices to grow for drugs once they're approved and adopted. So manufacturers can essentially increase prices whenever they want over a given year. That does not happen in other countries as well. So that's another challenge we have to deal with. We also hear from industry at times that we need high prices in the US to fund the research and development necessary to bring all of this innovation, not just to the US, to the rest of the world. So we essentially need to subsidize the R&D effort. But then you see statistics like this, suggesting in this case, 9 of the 10 top big pharma companies spend more, in some cases much more, on sales and marketing versus R&D. We also know from the COVID-19 pandemic that a lot of development and innovation with vaccines and with treatments is initially federally funded. It's not just basic science that's funded, and at times it's also clinical trials that are funded by the government. So it's not necessarily just the industry that's spending this money on R&D. So the final segment, we'll talk about should drug pricing policy change? Sorry about that. And will it? So there are a lot of current debates going on about this. Multiple pieces of legislation currently floating through Congress. Some of these pieces are relatively narrow in scope and they focus on kind of clear abuses of the system. So in some cases, there are what are known as pay for delay tactics. So brand manufacturers may pay generic companies to delay their entry into the market so that they can preserve revenue for a little while longer, those kinds of things. Others wanted to go bigger and empower Medicare to negotiate on the basis of essentially negotiate on their own terms, but there's an implication that Medicare should think about the value, whatever they're paying for. But interestingly, a lot of those pieces of legislation tie what Medicare should pay to what's paid in other countries, which is a technique known as reference pricing. which is kind of interesting. I think I and some others of my colleagues feel that this is sort of an importation of value constructs from other settings. In some cases, it may even be technically a challenge. So if you think about importing a price from the UK where there may have been a cost effectiveness evaluation done, there likely was one done. But let's say that evaluation compared a new treatment to a different comparator that isn't on the market here. And so is that analysis and that the price that comes from that analysis even worth importing or appropriate to import? So we really feel that a value-based system is appropriate. This is the tone we take in the book, but it has to be a homegrown value-based system. And there are roadblocks that are on both sides of the aisle. The pharma industry is quite a powerful lobby. So some of these pieces of legislation were making their way through Congress. In some cases, Republicans were stonewalling the legislation. In other cases, it was Democrats, centrist Democrats, who were stepping out of the fray and saying, I don't think I want to support this. So we're not really sure what's going to happen at this point. So what does health technology assessment in the US look like in the future? Again, lots of policy discussion and debate about this. There are criticisms of the framework for assessing value of drugs, and they exist here. They also echo many concerns that have been stated around international HTA. So it may not be the case that a single cost effectiveness threshold or a range is appropriate in all cases. You may need to make adjustments for rare disease, for example, or for other situations in which you need to kind of suspend that thinking a bit because of special issues. Others are concerned that the patient voice is not explicitly or quantitatively accounted for. That's beginning to change. So HTA organizations are embracing the idea that patients should be involved not only in giving their testimony and their stories, but also in the research itself. Interestingly, the current proposals that I just talked about in Congress talk about all of these approaches to drug pricing relief, but there is no mention of an HTA mechanism, an ICER-like body doing this work. And so no one is really sure if the political winds have changed enough from the Corey days to actually conceive of the idea that there could be a government-funded or a government-embedded HTA body that would help to make these recommendations. At the same time, ICER still stays in the private sector. It's quite a visible organization now. Many commercial players rely on ICER reports to provide information in an independent fashion. Other stakeholders are quite engaged with the organization, and including a number of manufacturers. So they've made an attempt to be collaborative. A number of manufacturers have done so as well. And so I think it's an interesting model to see how it plays out over the next few years. So with that, I will thank you all for your time. As Matt mentioned, The Right Price is available at Porter Square Books. You can also find it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, bookshop.org, and other places as well. There's how you can contact me, and I look forward to your questions.
So, thank you so much, Dan. That was fascinating. If anyone has questions, use the Q&A button or raise your hand and I can unmute you and you can talk directly. With the research, I'm sorry if you said this, but maybe clarifying the research that had gone into the book, how long did that, like what span of time was that before or for writing the book?
Yeah, so it was about an 18-month process. We had some experience with many of the topics in the book. Peter Newman actually had a relationship with Oxford University Press already. They were really interested in taking some works that he'd been part of that were much more technical and trying to make this more accessible to a broader audience. And so, and we thought that talking about the emergence of ICER would be an important component, an important addition to the literature as well. So Yeah, so it was 18 months. A good chunk of those months were spent with the three of us arguing with each other about what the right tone to take would be in particular chapters, but it was all to the good. So it looks like a couple of questions have come in.
Yeah. So Jerome Slate says, is the USA approach to drug price control an exercise of, quote, perfect being the enemy of the good, quote unquote?
So the current approach to US drug pricing, I don't know if that's the way to describe it. The book talks a lot about the challenges in economist speak, the information asymmetry that goes into thinking about prices and value. And the information asymmetry really refers to the notion that the people buying the product don't have as much information as the people selling it. That makes bargaining very difficult. And we also have a situation in which the consumer, so, we all see these endless ads on TV for new drugs, but there's not really anything we as individuals can do about that other than go to our doctor and say we saw an ad on television. So we're even further removed from that bargaining. And so I don't know that I would describe the current approach as perfect. I think that there are challenges, as I mentioned, with cost effectiveness analysis. There are a lot of people that criticize the quality, that feel that it's discriminatory towards people with more severe conditions. We talk about that in the book as well. But I think it's a useful input into a broader conversation. And there, I think you don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You don't want the search for a perfect measure of health, because you'll never find it, to be the enemy of the good.
Next question is from Larry Fryer. Does the government not contribute to research, or does not the government contribute to research? Is how it's written?
Yes, the US government absolutely does. So there have been reductions in government funding for both basic research and later stage clinical trials, and industry has actually stepped in to fill that void to an extent. I think the latest statistics that I've seen suggest that government still contributes about 40% of the money spent on research and development for prescription drugs in the US. So they're a significant player. And in a high profile sense, the mRNA platform that has brought us two of the vaccines was actually developed with a significant amount of government funding.
He actually raised his hand for follow-up. If Larry, you should be able to unmute yourself if you'd like.
Is that okay?
Yep,